What if I told you that the wisest man who ever lived was also the most tragic? What if the greatest temple ever built became the site of humanity's deepest fall? What if the king who spoke with God face to face ended up leading an entire nation into darkness? This is the story of Solomon, a story that begins with divine promise and ends with divine judgment, a story that reveals the terrifying fragility of even the greatest human hearts. Picture this: a young prince, barely more than a boy, suddenly thrust onto the throne of Israel. His father David, the giant slayer, the psalmist, the man after God's own heart, is dead. The kingdom stands at a crossroads. Will it splinter into chaos? Will enemies devour it like wolves? But something extraordinary happens. Something that has never happened before and will never happen again. God appears to Solomon in a dream, not a vision, not through a prophet, but directly, intimately, personally. And he asks the most dangerous question ever posed to a human being. Ask for whatever you want me to give you. Pause and think about this. The creator of the universe, the one who spoke galaxies into existence, is offering a blank check to a mortal man. What would you ask for? Power? Wealth? Long life? Victory over enemies? Fame that would echo through eternity? But Solomon's answer reveals something profound about the human soul. He doesn't ask for what he wants. He asks for what he needs. Give me wisdom to govern your people. And in that moment, in that single request, Solomon becomes the wisest man who ever lived. But here's what's haunting about this story. Wisdom isn't protection against folly. Intelligence isn't immunity against sin. Knowledge isn't a shield against corruption. God is so pleased with Solomon's request that he doesn't just grant wisdom. He pours out blessing like a flood. Wisdom, yes, but also riches beyond imagination. Honor that makes kings bow in reverence, and peace that transforms a war-torn nation into a golden age. The young king begins to build something unprecedented in human history. But first, he must prove his wisdom. Two women stand before his throne, both claiming the same baby. One child is dead, one is alive, and both mothers swear the living child is theirs. The nation watches. How do you solve the unsolvable? How do you see into the human heart when deception wears the mask of motherhood? Solomon's solution is brilliant and terrifying. Bring me a sword. Cut the living child in two. The false mother nods in agreement. If she cannot have the child, neither can her rival. But the true mother cries out in anguish. No! Give her the baby. Don't kill him. In that moment, Solomon sees what others cannot see. The mother's love reveals the truth. Wisdom isn't just about knowing facts. It's about understanding the human heart. Word spreads like wildfire. The king who can see through any deception, who can solve any mystery, who can make any judgment. Visitors begin arriving from every corner of the known world. Kings send delegations. Queens leave their thrones to journey across deserts and mountains just to hear Solomon speak. His wisdom becomes legendary, his proverbs treasured, his understanding of nature and humanity unmatched. But the greatest achievement is yet to come. Solomon announces something that makes the ancient world hold its breath. He will build a temple for God. Not just any temple, the most magnificent structure ever conceived. Cedar from Lebanon, gold from Ophir, bronze that gleams like fire, stones so massive they dwarf human imagination. 7 years of construction, employing tens of thousands of workers, costing a fortune that would bankrupt most nations. When the temple is complete, something happens that defies description. The Ark of the Covenant, containing the stone tablets God wrote with his own finger, is brought into the Holy of Holies. And then God arrives. Not symbolically, not spiritually, but physically. His glory fills the temple so powerfully that the priests cannot stand. The cloud of his presence is so dense, so overwhelming, that worship stops because no one can function in the raw presence of divinity. Solomon stands before this manifestation of God and prays a prayer that echoes through history. He dedicates the temple not just to Israel, but to all humanity. He asks God to hear the prayers of foreigners, to show mercy to the repentant, to demonstrate his love to all nations through this sacred place. For a moment, it seems like paradise has been restored. God dwelling with humanity, wisdom guiding nations, peace flowing like a river. But then the shadows begin to lengthen. Success becomes Solomon's enemy. Wealth becomes his trap. The very blessings God poured out become the poison that corrupts his heart. The king who once asked for wisdom to serve others now uses wisdom to serve himself. The man who built a temple for God begins building palaces for pleasure. The ruler who brought peace to Israel begins forming alliances that compromise everything his kingdom stands for. It starts innocently enough. Political marriages to secure alliances. Trade agreements that bring exotic goods and foreign customs. But each compromise creates another. Each step away from God makes the next step easier. Solomon, the man who once spoke with divine authority, begins listening to other voices, darker voices, seductive voices that promise even greater power and pleasure. 700 wives, 300 concubines. Think about this staggering number. This isn't love, this is addiction. This isn't romance, this is conquest. Each marriage brings new gods, new altars, new abominations into the holy city. The man who built the temple of the true God begins building temples to false gods. The king who once judged between truth and lies begins worshiping lies himself. But here's the most chilling part of the story. Solomon's apostasy isn't dramatic. There's no single moment of rebellion, no grand declaration of independence from God. It's subtle, gradual, almost imperceptible. A little compromise here, a small accommodation there. The slow drift of a heart that once burned with pure devotion. The wise king becomes the foolish king. The man who understood the human heart better than anyone loses his own. The ruler who brought peace to a nation brings division that will tear it apart. God's anger burns against Solomon not because he lacks knowledge, but because he possesses knowledge yet chooses rebellion anyway. The judgment comes not with thunder and lightning, but with quiet, devastating certainty. God appears to Solomon again, but this time there is no offer of gifts, no blank check of blessing. Instead, there is the pronouncement of consequence. Since you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my decrees, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. But even in judgment, mercy appears. The kingdom will not be torn apart during Solomon's lifetime, and one tribe will remain with his son for the sake of David and Jerusalem. God's love doesn't disappear when we fail. It simply takes different forms, sometimes forms that look like discipline but are actually rescue operations for our souls. Solomon's story becomes a mirror held up to humanity. How many of us start with noble intentions? How many begin with pure hearts and wise choices? How many receive blessings and opportunities that could transform not just our lives but the lives of everyone around us? And how many of us, gradually, almost imperceptibly, begin to drift? The pattern is always the same. Success leads to self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency leads to compromising convictions. Compromising convictions leads to corrupted character. Corrupted character leads to catastrophic consequences. Not just for us, but for everyone connected to us. Solomon's fall doesn't just destroy his own life. It shatters a kingdom, fractures a people, and echoes through generations. When Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam faces a delegation from the northern tribes. They ask for one thing: relief from the crushing taxes and forced labor Solomon imposed to fund his building projects and lavish lifestyle. It's a simple request, an opportunity for healing and unity. But Rehoboam, influenced by young counselors who never learned wisdom, responds with arrogance and threats. My father made your yoke heavy, but I will make it even heavier. The kingdom splits that very day. 10 tribes rebel and form the northern kingdom of Israel. Only Judah and Benjamin remain loyal to the house of David. The golden age is over. The unified kingdom David built and Solomon expanded becomes two rival nations that will eventually destroy each other. Civil war, foreign invasions, exile, and ultimately the destruction of both kingdoms. All traced back to Solomon's slow drift away from God. But the story doesn't end with failure. Centuries later, when the temple Solomon built lies in ruins and the people are scattered in exile, the prophets begin speaking of another king. Not another flawed human ruler, but a perfect king who will never drift, never compromise, never fall. They call him the Son of David, the Prince of Peace, the one whose kingdom will have no end. And when this promised king finally appears, he doesn't come with Solomon's wealth or worldly wisdom or political power. He comes as a servant, teaching in parables instead of building palaces, healing the broken instead of ruling from a throne. Yet he claims to be greater than Solomon, possessing wisdom not just about human hearts but about divine love. Where Solomon built a physical temple that could be destroyed, this king builds a spiritual temple in human hearts that cannot be torn down. The greatest irony of Solomon's story is that his very failure points to humanity's need for a perfect king. His tragic end becomes a prophecy of hope. The temple he built was magnificent but temporary. The kingdom he ruled was glorious but fragile. The wisdom he possessed was extraordinary but limited. But the king the prophets promised would build eternal temples, rule unshakable kingdoms, and possess infinite wisdom. Today, we face the same choice Solomon faced. We receive blessings, opportunities, talents, and influence. The question isn't whether we'll be tested, we will. The question is whether we'll learn from Solomon's story. Will we use our gifts to serve ourselves or others? Will we let success make us self-sufficient or grateful? Will we protect our hearts or let them drift? Solomon's story is both warning and promise. Warning of how quickly even the greatest can fall. Promise that failure isn't the end of the story. The same God who judged Solomon's rebellion also preserved his lineage so that the perfect king could come. The same God who allows us to experience the consequences of our choices also works through those consequences to accomplish his purposes. Look around at our world today. We see the same patterns Solomon experienced. Unprecedented prosperity leading to spiritual poverty. Technological wisdom accompanied by moral foolishness. Global connectivity creating local isolation. The very blessings that could bring humanity together being used to tear us apart. Solomon's story isn't ancient history. It's current events. But here's the hope that emerges from the ruins. God's purposes are bigger than human failure. Solomon's apostasy couldn't stop the coming of the perfect king. Our failures can't stop God's plans for redemption. The temple Solomon built was destroyed, but God is building a better temple. The kingdom Solomon ruled was divided, but God is establishing an eternal kingdom. The wisdom Solomon possessed was corrupted, but perfect wisdom has appeared in human form. The story of Solomon forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What gifts have we been given? How are we using them? What compromises are we making? What voices are we listening to? Where are our hearts drifting? These aren't theoretical questions. They're diagnostic questions that could save our souls. But more than questions, Solomon's story offers us a choice. We can learn from his mistakes or repeat them. We can guard our hearts or let them drift. We can use our blessings to serve others or ourselves. We can seek the perfect King Solomon's story points to, or try to build our own kingdoms on shifting sand. The temple Solomon built is gone, but the God who filled it with his presence is still here. The kingdom Solomon ruled is history, but the eternal kingdom is still being built. The wisdom Solomon possessed was just a shadow of the wisdom available to anyone who asks. The choice is ours. The time is now. The story continues, and we get to choose how our chapter ends. What will you choose? Will you be remembered as someone who used their gifts to serve themselves or to serve others? Will your story be one of gradual drift or steadfast faithfulness? Will you learn from Solomon's tragedy or repeat it? The greatest tragedy wouldn't be failing like Solomon. It would be failing to learn from Solomon. The story of the wisest man who ever lived is ultimately the story of human potential and human frailty, divine blessing and human responsibility, earthly kingdoms and eternal hope. It's the story that explains why we need more than human wisdom, more than earthly kingdoms, more than temporary temples. It's the story that points us to the perfect king who never drifts, whose kingdom never falls, whose temple can never be destroyed. Solomon's story is finished, but yours is still being written. Choose wisely.